Hello and welcome to another episode of the CRM MVP podcast. This episode is episode number 37. And this episode, I don't have a guest. And the reason for that, and I love the guests that I have, by the way. I think that, they've been fantastic. And I've been really lucky that every time I reach out to someone to see if they want to be a guest on the podcast, they've said yes. With the exception of two people, actually. There's two people out there that sort of, one ghosted me so far, and the other one straight up said no. And those people are Mark Benioff, who again, he follows me on Twitter, so I figure I can send them a few DMs, a few direct messages. And, one of the things that I do is every time I find some interesting news, I'll just say quote unquote interesting news about Salesforce, I reach out and I ask him for an explanation. He never really answers, but at one point I asked him if he wanted to be a guest on the CRM MVP podcast, and he said no because he was too busy with Dreamforce that was coming up. I think Dreamforce was about like a month away or something, and Dreamforce is a massive, obviously, Salesforce conference. So he was preparing for that. However, I did mention that I would interview him after Dreamforce if he was open to it, and I did reach out to him after Dreamforce, but he hasn't responded. So Mark Benioff, if you know how to reach him, please tell him to be a guest on the podcast. And the other person was Satya. I actually reached out to Satya Nadella, and I sent him an email, and I said, hey, I'm going to be in Redmond, and I would love to interview you for the CRM MVP podcast, and I didn't hear anything from him. So I don't know. I guess Satya and Mark have better things to do than being a guest on the podcast. But other than that, everyone else that I have asked to be a guest on the podcast has been willing and able to be a guest, and I'm thankful for that. Great people that I get to talk to. But there are some episodes that I'm always sort of concerned to invite someone, and the main reason for that is because the topic or the things that I'm going to be covering on the episode might not be the most friendly. I don't know if friendly is a word that we should use for this, but they're not the best approach, I would say, to a discussion. And again, the funny thing is that some of these solo episodes in which, again, I don't want to drag somebody with me into criticism and all of that, are some of my most popular ones, right? In terms of downloads and people listening to them and getting feedback from it. Every time I do an episode that is like an episode that we sort of universally agree with, like the episode about diversity, no one really comes to me and says, I disagree with diversity. There are some situations where you record an episode and everybody sort of like agrees, and that's the last thing you hear about it. But some episodes that I've recorded in the past, like episode number 20, for example, where I talked about the best practice, the 20 best practices I disagree with, got a ton of feedback, positive and negative. There were some people that are very dedicated and took notes throughout the episode. And I think that maybe they do that with every episode, but on that one they took notes and then they send me their notes. And by the way, if you want to send me anything, info@crmmvppodcast.com is our email address. And they send me their notes, or they posted their notes on LinkedIn or whatever it was, whatever they found the podcast, and they let me know what they thought, whether they agreed or disagree with me. And one of the main reasons why I enjoy doing this podcast is to learn from other people who I respect, who are professionals out there implementing Dynamics 365 for a living and have learned lessons the hard way, sort of the same way I learned my lessons, or I guess the majority of my lessons, which is trying something, having it fail, and then sort of changing along the way until you feel like you know what you're doing, and you rarely do something that requires you to go back and redo the work. So every time I get the chance to talk to somebody who is out there implementing Dynamics for a living and who wants to sort of give me their 2 cents, I'm open ears for it, right? I love that. So every time I think of a topic that might be controversial or might be something that I take a stand on, I try to stay away from inviting other people, not because I don't respect their opinion. Obviously, that's far from the truth, but it's because I don't want to drag them down with me, if that's a thing. And especially on episodes like the one today. And I'll tell you how I came up sort of with the idea for the topic of today's episode. The idea for this topic was mainly because I was working with a customer today, and we were doing some workshop, which is essentially CRM admin one-on-one sessions where I get to transfer knowledge so they can own their solution after we go live. And for this customer, we were talking about form and field, editing and customization. And I found myself saying multiple times, like, I never do this or I never do that. I use the word never a lot. And I feel that, when I cover episodes like this one, like if I think about episode number 20, for example, episode number 20, which was the best practices I disagree with, I remember that, that episode got some criticism from other MVPs as well. And some of the criticism we covered, for example, in episode 24, the episode I recorded with Gustav, in which he said, look, even though I agree with you for the most part, I can never say never, right? There are some situations where you do want to do that, where you do want to develop a bunch, or you do want, whatever it was, like regardless of the best practice. I think he agreed with me on, I don't know, let's say 75% of them. But then the other 25, he said, I agree with you for the most part, but there are some situations that calls for you to break your stance on it. In other words, I guess in that case, because we were talking about best practice I disagree with, I think that in some situations you agree with those best practices. I don't know what it was, but the whole point is he couldn't agree with me on the fact that you should never agree with those. That the word never is something that doesn't sit well with some professionals. So today when I was working on that workshop with our customer, I thought to me, like after the session, I said, is there a way that I can sit down and write down a list of 10 things that I would never use or do or execute, however you want to call it? Is there a list of 10 things that I just never, under any circumstance, would do in Dynamics 365, even though it's functionality that a lot of people might be using today, by the way? So that's why I consider this episode might be a little controversial, is because I'm about to talk about things that perhaps you use all the time and you think is perfectly fine. And I'm about to tell you that I think is completely insane to do that, right? So CRMEG Summit is around the corner. I'll be there. If you're listening to this episode and you take some notes and you want to stop by and talk to me about why you disagree and give me your thoughts and lessons that you learn to make me sort of change the way I feel about some of these, I will love that. Please do that. I'm there to learn just like you, and best way to learn is either by your own experience or talking to someone else who has a ton of experience. That's why I love reading books, and I've talked about the fact that I read at least 30 minutes every night before going to bed, is because I feel that, for $12 or $15 or whatever, you can learn the things that took somebody 30 years and, losing their legs or whatever over it. You can just sit down and in a few nights or in a few weeks, learn something that costs somebody a huge pain and life experience. And you can just learn it essentially overnight. Super, super simple. So because of that, I love to learn from people on events like the CRMEG Summit. And I hope that you stop me and talk about this. So again, today's episode is about the 10 things that I never ever use or do in Dynamics 365. I call this my not even once list. So without further ado, episode number 37 of the CRM MVP podcast starts now. Before we start going down the list of things that I never use, I want to start by saying that I don't have an agenda for this episode. I guess it's clear by now. I don't have a script or anything like that. So I have no idea how long this episode is going to be. I'm going to try to stick, obviously, to the normal 45 minutes to 60 minutes. But, once I get talking about it, who knows what's going to be. So I apologize in advance if this episode is too long. I hope you enjoy it. Again, I'm just talking off the cuff here. I'm just going through the list and tell you what I think about it. And I hope that you can let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree. Let's see it. And like I mentioned before, I think that people like Gustav, who's another CRM MVP, and I highly respect him. He's been implementing Dynamics forever. Super legitimate experience. Obviously, I respect that. I think that if I ask Gustav if there are things that he would put on paper and say that he would never do or he would never use, I mean, there's a chance that his list has 0 things, right? I think that there's a lot of people that would say, for the most part, I wouldn't do this, but I can see how I could use it, right? I can think of situations where I would do it. And this list for me represents a list of things that I would never do, no matter what. There's no situation that I can think of that would make me use it. So let's get started. Let's go down the list and see what we get. So number 1 is pretty simple, which is whole number fields. And by the way, before we keep moving forward, this will be I don't know if we call it technical episode, because we're not going to be talking about code or anything like that. But knowledge of Dynamics 365 is highly encouraged, because I'm going to assume that you're a professional or you're a user and you know about Dynamics. You're a CRM admin or whatever it is. So I'm going to talk about these things, and I might give you a little bit of a few examples here and there, but I'm going to assume you're not a complete rookie with Dynamics. If you are, then obviously as you work with it, this will make more sense. So listen to it in the future. So number 1 is whole number fields. Whole number is a data type of field that you can create in Dynamics 365 that I find completely useless. And I do understand that you might be listening to this and say, but Gus, there are some formats that whole number fields you can use with it. You cannot use it with anything else. I don't care. It doesn't matter. The fact that you can create time zones, who cares? That's just not very practical in projects. I have over 200 implementations. I've never used a whole number field to capture a time zone on a project before. I've never done that. So maybe you have, and maybe you can find use for it. I personally think they're useless. They're complete time bombs, essentially. They are a field that is essentially sitting there waiting for the customer to change their mind or to change their requirement and tell you that now they need decimals. So decimal numbers are way more useful and way more flexible. If I need a whole number to capture a whole number on an entity, I create a decimal and I set the precision to 0. Once you set the precision to 0, it looks exactly like a whole number, exactly like it. However, the precision can be changed later on. You can go back and change it from 0 to all the way up to 10 decimal points, right? So you might go live with a whole number. Let's say you added a field on the account form to capture what is the maximum discount this customer is entitled to, or something like that, which is something that you might be using a default or a price list for, or a discount list for, or whatever. There might be some other functionality you're doing, but just entertain me for this second. And let's just say that you want just a simple field capturing what is the maximum discount you can give this customer. And perhaps you ask the customer and they say, it's either 5, 10, or 15%. Those are the discounts we provide. And that's it. That's all we do. Now, you might feel tempted to make this an option set because it's easy, right? 5, 10, 15, boom, done. But the problem is that those requirements will change. I promise you. As you start doing the user training or whatever, somebody's going to raise their hand and say, but what about those customers that we give 12% sometimes? What about those special occasions where we give 20 or 2 or whatever, right? And now what are you going to do? Keep adding options to your option set? Maybe. But if you're trying to do something related to calculated fields or something in the future, now you're in the pain zone, right? You're going to have to figure out a way to get around that. So it's a lot easier to have a field with a number in there. You can always automate that with a business rule or a workflow. If the customer is certain type or whatever, a gold customer or whatnot, set the value to 10 or whatever. You can always automate some of it. So I don't think that making it an option set will be super important at that point. But the point is that as you go live, there will be always someone who raise their hand, or things will change. The business will evolve. That's one of the benefits of Dynamics 365, that if you do it right, there will be some benefits to the business. So they will evolve as a business. And they're going to come back to you and say, look, sometimes we make exceptions where we don't give people the full 10%, but we do agree to 7.5%. But now you use a whole number and you're stuck, right? So the whole idea behind this, by using decimal numbers, is that you can always go back and increase the precision. Now, you may come back to me and say, but Gus, I'm a huge Daryl Labar fan, and I use his attribute manager in the XRM toolbox, and it's super easy to change from whole number to decimal number. And I would say, I'm a huge fan of Daryl Labar and the attribute manager too. However, that is essentially fixing what you did. You're redoing the work. Now, you're having a tool that is doing it for you, and the tool is awesome. By the way, I got nothing about. There's a session that I do every year at the CRMG Summit called my top 10 favorite free tools for Dynamics 365. There are tools on that list that come and go. Every year I have one or two that are new that I've just fell in love with, right? That attribute manager is unshakable. That thing is always on that list because it's awesome. Now, I don't use it a whole lot because, again, I have this strong sort of set of best practices I set up on myself, like don't use whole numbers. What I don't see the need to do it, but there's a lot of cases in which I've seen, especially when I work with customers that implement it with somebody else or self-implemented themselves, don't follow the same best practices. I take a chance with the attribute manager to fix some of their stuff. And we will talk about a few other customizations in the future on this list of the things that I never do, not only once. But once again, even if you tell me that, hey, no, but I fix it with the attribute manager, yeah, well, you're still having to redo the work. I mean, the attribute manager goes out there and creates a new field and moves the data, unpublishes stuff, republishes stuff. I don't know what Daryl put on it. I don't know how it works. I just know it works. The thing is awesome. But the whole point is you're redoing all of the work. You're having to redo it. It's a tool doing it for you, but you're having to redo it. Why would you go through all that trouble and risk, right, of having to change millions of records potentially of data when you can just increase the precision? It just doesn't make any sense, right? And years ago when I worked for another partner before I started Elevate Solutions in 2014, I created and ran or led the CRM Black Belt training that it's still out today for CRM User Group, and it's a great training program. I was teaching customization of forms and fields and views and all of that on the Blue Belt course of the 4 Black Belt courses. The Blue Belt deals with all those customizations, and every week I taught people, not to use whole numbers. So I've ran that class. I mean, the Blue Belt class, I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say over 100 times, maybe, right? Over the years that I led the program. And obviously, outside of that, customization and configuration courses, I've taught this before. There was only one time, and I hope you're listening to this, whoever person, called this out. I think I was called out maybe at a conference. I wasn't even teaching a class. But I was called out about the fact that I thought using whole numbers is insane, that there's no benefit to it. The way I see it, I mean, those formats that you never use are not a benefit. And the fact that once you create a whole number, you need something like Daryl's attribute manager, or you need to, redo the work manually in order to fix it, it just makes no sense. And one person called me out on it and said, actually, there's one benefit which has to do with storage. Which is true, by the way, I agree. The whole number fields takes half the space in number of bits to store a value versus a decimal number. Decimal number takes twice the amount of bits as the whole number field. But honestly, unless you have like 100 million records or something like that, where you might see these in terms of megs or gigs, I don't even know like how much space will be at that point. I just don't see the risk for it. You have a few 100,000 accounts. I just don't think your database is going to increase that much by having a decimal number versus a whole number. Like it just doesn't. It's never been a problem for me. Again, after over 200 implementations, it's never been a problem for me where I look at my data storage and I'm like, I wish I had used whole number fields. Never, not once that's happened to me. I'm not saying this hasn't happened to anybody out there, right? If you're listening to this and this happened to you, let me know. Obviously, I would like to hear more about it. But to me, it's never happened before. So are there absolutely no advantages of using whole numbers versus decimal numbers? No, I would say storage-wise, whole numbers take a little bit less space in number of bits. But other than that, they just cause a huge amount of pain and they are completely useless. Seriously, don't use whole numbers. Do yourself a favor. Don't do it. Say no to whole numbers. Not even once. Staying, I guess, in the same sort of approach with fields. Let's talk about another field type I don't like using ever, and I absolutely think this is ridiculous, which is non-global option sets. If you use non-global option sets on your projects or your system, you need to stop that. There's just absolutely no value to it or no benefit to it versus global option sets. And the reason for that is because, one of the rules that we should follow as a customizer, as an editor, or as a CRM admin, however you see it, solution architect, functional consultant, etc. People that customize dynamics to meet business outcomes and expectations from our customers. If you're doing that, one of the rules that you follow is you need to check to see if there's something in the system you can use before you create something custom or something new, right? That is one important rule that you follow. I actually have a few rules when I teach customizers this. Number one rule is keep it simple. Number two is always check to see if there's something that you can use instead of creating something new. Now that rule has a caveat where we say you don't want to repurpose an entity for what it wasn't supposed to be, right? Because there are bad examples with that as well, but I'm not going to go into that today. All I'm going to say is you always should check to see if there's something there that you can use rather than create something new. One example is somebody may come to you and say, look, when we talk to contacts, they sometimes have more than one email address. So can you add a couple of fields to capture more than one email address, right? If you don't check to see if there's something there you can use, you might find yourself creating custom email address fields, whereas if you just checked what fields are there that might not be on the form but are there on the entity, you can see that there's email address 2 and email address 3 fields already in the system. You just have to put them on the form and publish them and you're good to go. So you should always check, and this applies also to a secondary set of address fields or whatever it is. There are some requests that will always come from customers or for projects or whoever that are already in the system that are just not visible. So we should always check to see if there's something there that we can use rather than create it from scratch. And that applies to option sets, right? If you create an option set, a non-global option set, then that's it. You only use it once and that's it. Now with a global option set, it is stored in the system and is available next time when you need it. And notice that I say when you need it, because rarely you create an option set that you don't use again. It doesn't happen that often. Even in option sets where I look at it and I say like, there's no way we're going to use this anywhere else. Or the customer will say, it only that entity, quotes, that's it. That's the only entity that will get that option set or that list of options, right? Then you look back and you say, and then 6 months down the road, they're like, well, can you add that same option set to opportunities or whatever it is and have it transferred to quotes, right? Because it happens all the time in implementation. So never create non-global option sets. Do yourself a favor, create it as a global, save it in the system. It's 2 extra clicks. It's the same amount of work to add the options and organize them and all of that. So it's 2 extra clicks. One to say that this is an existing option set, and then you click on the new button. And that's it. 2 extra clicks that can save you a ton of time, right? Global option sets work great when it comes to workflows. There's just a lot of benefits from doing global option sets. The fact that if you need to add an option and that global option set is in 3 or 4 different places or entities, you add it once and it reflects everywhere. I mean, come on. It's a no-brainer. Don't use non-global option sets. Just don't do it. And I've even talked to MVPs that, always sort of joke about the fact that it's such an important best practice to not create, non-global option sets. But then when you look at the out-of-the-box option sets that come with Dynamics, they're all local, which sort of like contradicts you. It's, it could put somebody on a position where, well, I know you're saying that, but Microsoft is saying local option sets are cool. It doesn't matter. Honestly, don't do it. Not even once. Okay, so let's talk about number 3. Number 3 is something I never ever use, no matter what, which is organization-owned entities, or organization-owned custom entities, to be more precise. When you create a custom entity in Dynamics, you know that there is a drop-down menu called ownership type. And that ownership type says there's 2 options in there. One says user or team, which is the default, and then the other one says organization. The organization ownership type is completely useless. I'm about to, I don't know, if there's someone out there that disagrees, I'll love to. I want to do like, I'm pretty sure you guys have seen that meme where, the guy is sitting and it has a statement and it says, change my mind below. I want to do one of those for the summit. I'm going to create a banner that says, organization-owned custom entities are useless, change my mind, and see who sits down. Because I guarantee almost no one will sit down to argue that. If you look at sort of the basis or the way organization entities work, they don't do anything extra that a user or a team-owned entity does. All they do extra is take away your ability to customize them. That's pretty much it. That's all they do. They're completely useless otherwise. Because when you create an organization-owned entity, you don't have an owner field. And maybe that is the only reason why somebody might consider remotely using an organization entity. That they might look at it and look at the fact that, oh, look, we don't need an owner field. This is owned by the company. Let's just create it as organization-owned. But if you don't need an owner field, just hide it. Get rid of it from the views. Hide it on the form. It will be set by default. And if you want to use it as an organization-owned entity, create it as a user or a team and give it all organization on the security roles, right? Organization read and write and whatever permissions you want, maybe not delete, but everything else, just set it to the highest level, organization. It will behave exactly like an organization-owned entity would. No difference. So user or team ownership with permissions all the way to organization level, hide the owner fields, you will get the exact same behavior. There's no difference. Now, you do have the flexibility in the future that if a year down the road or months down the road, whatever, somebody comes and says, you know what? Now that I think about it, some people should only be able to see records that are owned, that belong, they might not use the word own, that belong to their business unit. Can you make that happen? No. If you use organization-owned entities, the answer is no. Because with organization-owned entities, you either can see nothing or none, or you can see everything, which is organization permissions. So we know that with user or team-owned, you can do those 2 things too, none and organization, everything. But there's also the levels in between. You have user, business unit, and parent-child business unit. You have those levels of access that you can leverage in the future if something changes. So things change. I'm telling you, even things that are right now, we're configuring Dynamics for right now, and that entity is there's not going to have any owner. I guarantee you, an acquisition later, something changes in the process later, whatever it is, they're going to come back and they're going to ask you to add an owner to it. Or maybe they're not going to ask you to add the owner field to it, but they're going to ask for more control over it. And when you use an organization-owned entity, you lose all control. It's gone. You either see everything or you see nothing. And that's it. There's no in between, 1 and 0, right? Which is sort of how I feel today going through this list. It's 1 or 0. You either use it or you don't use it, right? I never create organization-owned entities. Now, if I think about the types of entities you can create, there's obviously the user or team-owned entity. And under that, you've noticed probably that you can create a custom activity entity. Now, custom activity entities is something that I would have added to a list like this one and say never. However, I do know that there are some situations, although they're far in between, right? Few and far in between, that I probably would think about using a custom activity entity. I stay away from them as much as possible. I just don't see the need for it. I don't see the need for a custom activity entity. And the reason for that is because every time I talk to a customer and they need a custom activity entity, it's really a type or a subset of another existing entity, right? You might talk to a customer in manufacturing or something like that, and they'll say, look, sometimes we don't have appointments with people, but we have our regular plant visits. So can you make an activity for plant visits? No, let's just make an appointment type called plant visit, and the other one is called sales appointment or appointment, and then you leave it the way it is, and you use the appointment entity for plant visits and non-plant visits. Why? Because even if you're going to make a plant visit, it's still an appointment. You still want it on your calendar. You're still going to go and do some work or meet with somebody or whatever it is. So because of that, I typically set those custom activities, quote unquote, as types of activities. Right? Somebody says, well, we don't want to use, we have phone calls and then we have whatever other types of prospecting calls or whatever. Okay, then we use phone call type, and you can pick prospecting call on the phone call type. But let's use as much as possible the things that are already out of the box. We already know that we cannot control permissions or visibility amongst the different activity types, like appointments and phone calls and emails, and all those things are bunched up together into activities. So why do I want to keep adding more complexity to the mix? It's a lot easier to pick from a drop-down menu and say what type of appointment or what type of phone call it is, rather than creating extra custom activities for it. Now, the only times where I think that is useful is when those things like plant visits are they need a lot of customization that perhaps I don't want to include on the appointment form, which I can still customize. So I could essentially, let's say using business rules or something like that, I could control visibility. So when they select a plant visit as the appointment type, some extra fields are shown or whatever. But if I know that the form is going to be completely different, I might consider using custom activity entities. Again, I don't say never with those, but almost never, I would say. So they didn't make it to the list. And if I go back to 1 and 2 on the list, which is hold numbers and non-global option sets, there's another field type that I almost added to the list, which is 2 option fields. I rarely use 2 option fields. I think they're overrated, right? People love 2 option fields until they have to add option number 3. That's when you hate 2 option fields, right? And you have to go back to Daryl's tool to try to fix it. Although I don't even know if he does it. I haven't tried it yet. It probably does because the tool is cool. But I don't think his tool will change an entity, for example, from organization ownership to user or team. So you're gonna be stuck with that, right? I don't think we have a organization manager on the XRM toolbox that you can use. Maybe we do. The XRM toolbox is also cool. Maybe there's stuff in there that I don't even know yet, but I think you're going to be stuck with that. So once again, the 2 option fields, I try to stay away from them. I think they're cool because you can create checkbox with them, which is essentially the only time when I use them. So if I know that a checkbox makes sense, I'll go ahead and do that. But for the most part, I feel that if there's a chance for more than 2 options, I want to do an option set, a global option set with 2 options on it. And then later on, they can go back and change their mind and add more options if they want to. But again, 2 option fields are limiting. Yeah, it's cool to have 2 radio buttons side by side or whatever. But honestly, the UI improvements from clicking a radio button or picking an option are minimal at best. I just don't see the benefit of it. So I try to stay away from them. But again, I don't want to say never because there are some situations where a checkbox makes sense. For example, one of the situations that I use a checkbox a lot is when I want to give people the ability to select which records will synchronize as part of their data integration. And I talked about this on a tip, or I think Lee, one of our technical consultants, talked about this on a tip for our 2-Minute Tuesday series on YouTube. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, go ahead and check it out. It's one of the early tips, so it's probably between 1 and 10, something like that. I don't remember exactly which one it is. We're up to almost 40 at this point, tips. So he talks about the fact that adding a checkbox to the form, I think we put it on the header at that point, and in a lot of projects we do it like that, where you can say whether this record should be part of the integration or not. And then as part of the filtering on the SIS package or whatever tool you're using for integration, you can say any records that don't have this checkbox checked, ignore them. So you can skip them for whatever reason, right, that you need. You want to skip integration for that record. For some reason, you can take the checkbox off. It won't be part of the integration. So again, I see myself using it once in a while, but it's not that often. It doesn't happen all the time. So because of that, it's not on the list, but it's sort of like a special mention. Maybe I'll put together a list of almost never. Top 10 almost never things. And then the checkbox or the 2-option field will be in there. And then the custom activity entity will be in there too. We'll see. If we start running out of content to talk about, you might hear a top 10 almost never list. But moving on to number 4 at this point is many-to-many relationships. More specifically, system many-to-many relationships. I don't like many-to-many relationships at all. Before we had system many-to-many relationships, which if I remember correctly, I think they were introduced in CRM 2011. We used to create manual many-to-many relationships. What's a manual many-to-many relationship? It's a custom entity that has a lookup from one entity to another. And again, for those of you listening, many-to-many relationships are situations where you want to relate many from one type or entity type to many of the other one. One example would be, if you are attending a conference, just speaking of the CRMEG Summit, you may want to have a relationship to say, this session was attended by this many people, this many attendees or contacts, but those contacts attended this many sessions too. So you have a many-to-many relationships between contact and session, between the contact and the session entities. The same thing would be true for if you're keeping track of other clubs that, maybe you're responsible for a country club or something like that, and you want to keep track of other clubs that your members are members of, you create a many-to-many relationship between contacts and clubs. So you can keep track of other clubs. Obviously, one club can have many members, and one person can be a member of many clubs. So the reason why I don't like to use system many-to-many relationships or out-of-the-box many-to-many relationships is because they literally do nothing that you can do with a manual many-to-many relationship. As a matter of fact, technically, they work exactly like a manual many-to-many relationship. Behind the scenes, Dynamics 365 creates this sort of like ghost bridge entity, if we're going to call it bridge entity, right? This ghost bridge entity, which then has lookups, essentially, or one-to-many relationships. I just call them lookups because it's easy, but one-to-many relationships to the two entities that are part of the many-to-many relationship. So if you created a system one, many-to-many relationship between contacts and sessions, just to keep using the example of CRMEG Summit or any other event for that matter, then behind the scenes, there will be this, entity keeping that one-to-many relationship to both. The problem is that entity behind the scenes is an entity that you cannot customize, you cannot see, you cannot report on, control access with, like it's completely hidden behind the scenes. Dynamics uses it to know, who is connected to whom, but there's really no benefit to it. Importing them is a nightmare. You have to have the right tools to do it. You cannot report on them. Is a pain. Now, it is having a manual many-to-many relationship. It's awesome, right? Complete flexibility. You create the entity, you can put the one-to-many relationships to the two entities or lookups to the two entities, and then you can add more stuff. If we go back to the example of the country club membership, you could add, when they became a member of the club, how many years, what kind of membership they have, how often they play golf in the country club. I mean, you can add a bunch of information on that bridge entity, if we're going to call it a bridge entity. And I've been calling it a bridge entity for a long time. So maybe if you attended a session with me in the past, you heard me talk about this. But the manual bridge entity, which is a custom entity, user or team owned, bridge entity behind the scenes, custom entity, that has all of the flexibility of a regular entity inside of Dynamics. You can report on it. You can import them. You can do charts, dashboards with it, deal with security roles to allow people to see them on. I mean, you can do whatever you want with it. It's completely flexible, which is awesome, right? And some people might say, well, Gus, the only advantage to using a system many-to-many is that you don't have to worry about that bridge entity and having to grant security and all that stuff. Well, maybe. Is that a benefit? Personally, I like the flexibility. I don't want someone to tell me this is your behavior you're expecting. This is all you're gonna get. That's it. You're done. I don't like that. I want it to be more flexible. So manual many-to-many all day long. System ones, no, not even once. Never use them, no matter what. And I can already hear people listening to this saying, like, what do you mean? There's some situations where you need. Doesn't matter to me. I don't think they're useful. I don't think there's any benefit to them. So change my mind. I'll see you at the summit. Okay, so number 5, and I've talked about this one before, probably on the top 20 best practice I disagree with. And again, I'm putting my foot down, never, not even once, which is the use of managed solutions to move functionality, specifically to move functionality from dev to UAT to production. I 100% stand behind using managed solutions for ISVs, for ISV or independent software vendors, for solutions that you sell. Totally, 100%. Do you? Like that's what they're for, in my opinion. But just to move functionality from one environment to another internally as part of your application lifecycle management, I think is insane. I just don't see the benefit of it. Even the benefits of it, they just don't sound like benefits to me. And I think that, when people talk to me about these benefits, they talk about them, they're the greatest thing. Like, you don't understand. Like, people cannot customize production directly. Well, but train them. Train them so they don't do that. Even if they could. Why do you need to put something in place that locks them up and prevents them from doing that, just in case they have some CRM amnesia and decide to customize the default solution in production? Why would they do that? Why would you give system admin rights to someone who's capable of doing something like that? Just don't do it, right? So, again, I was talking to a customer about this. They brought up the fact that Microsoft best practice is to use managed solutions because you can lock them up with the managed properties and say whether they can edit them or not. You can uninstall them if you want to get rid of it, and all those benefits with managed solutions. For me, they're just a pain. They're a huge pain. Like, I cannot even remember how many times I've tried to upgrade Dynamics or do a migration from on-prem to online or whatever, and there's some managed solutions in there no one can find the unmanaged solution for, even internal ones. Now, I know that there's a risk with ISVs because ISVs get acquired, they disappear, and you have maybe an auto number solution from an ISV from Pakistan that is no longer available. Whatever, like that could happen, and okay, that's a problem. You can find a replacement and try to figure it out. But I've seen implementations where the dev environment was in a sandbox server. The sandbox server was in a VM. The VM was in a hard drive that got destroyed on a fire and it was hit by a missile. And now you can't find the unmanaged solution. Now you're stuck. And the ISV doesn't exist because it was you. It was the guy who was here and now left the job because he wanted to be a firefighter, right? So those problems exist. They're way more often. You're going to see those problems way more often than problems like somebody's trying to edit production or UAT without going through dev first. Seriously, come on, right? We can do our jobs and train administrators so they at least know that you shouldn't customize production directly. That's it. So I personally don't see the benefits of using managed solutions. The whole idea that you can uninstall them. So what? What? By the time you make it to production, you shouldn't be uninstalling it, right? How's that a benefit? That you can make it all the way to production and be like, oops, and then go back and uninstall it? Come on. Seriously. Like it's just a non-issue. It's a non-issue. So managed solutions to move internal functionality from one environment to another, not even once. And again, I can already see Scott Sewell by now probably smash his headphones. I have to assume. If Scott listens to this, I don't know. I'm just assuming because he's a good friend. He supports me on my endeavors of pretending to be, a podcaster here. So thank you, Scott, for listening. But by this time you broke your headphones, because I can't imagine that some people will be listening to this and saying, like, you can't say that you never use managed solutions. Like, that makes, you can't really take, well, I'm taking the stance. I say that I'm never using managed solutions. I just don't see the use for it. Someday when some other, I don't know, some magical benefit of managed solutions comes out that makes me change my mind, I'll change my mind. But for now, I just don't see it. I don't see the benefit of it. I think it's useless. Seriously, it's whatever. We're 40 something minutes in, and I'm just ranting. I feel like this should be, episode number 37. Listen to Gus rant for an hour or whatever it is. Once again, it's all entertainment. If you're in this world, you probably, especially if you have the same background that I have, you'll probably be like, yes, finally somebody said never manage, never manage solutions. Well, good. Let's high five at the summit or at the MVP summit. If you're an MVP, love to see you there. Okay. I should start doing something like for every one of these you agree with, you have to buy me a beer, or maybe I have to buy you a beer. No, because then people will agree with me, and that's not what I want. I want people to disagree with me and talk differences. So let's just scrap the whole beer idea. Okay, so let's go back to the list. Let's talk about number 6. Number 6 is, again, one of those things that some people might say, well, it all depends on what you're trying to do. I'm going to say never to this one, not even once, and that is offline mode on the Outlook client. Never, not even once. This wasn't always my position, by the way. I think that before Mocha, the mobile companion application, I still call it Mocha. I feel that was a cool name. I think Microsoft probably got sued by somebody and then they lost the name. But I like Mocha, so sometimes I call it Mocha. Before Mocha, I found myself using offline client a couple times. I remember specifically doing an implementation for a company that they created, or they essentially created, sold, implemented, installed, etc. hydraulic equipment that would move like liquid and gas and things from one place to another within large factories. And one of their main things was they had to go into plants like in the middle of nowhere in Texas or whatever, oil plants, no cell phone coverage, let alone Wi-Fi or whatever, like plants that were completely off the grid, and they would have to capture information, right, about the assets the customer had, what devices they had, do inventories, keep track of, maintenance schedules and appointments and things like that. And because of that, they needed offline access. And I remember myself doing, having implementations of offline access on Outlook. Now, every time I had one of those, I always pushed to have the best workstations I could get, the best laptops, the best whatever I could get. Why? Because the Outlook client by itself, right, depending on how much data you're synchronizing and all of that, can be a huge drag on your performance on your workstation, right? And having offline mode, it was like a death warrant. It was over. Game over. Shut it down, guys. We're done. Right? Because what you're doing essentially is you're downloading a local subset of your Dynamics CRM functionality into your workstation. And obviously, it would never miss that because these are people, grunts that will go out on the field, walking and sweating in these big factories taking notes. They all got like a tough book, like a Panasonic tough book, which are great, I think. They don't perform amazingly, but they're pretty tough. That's for sure. But they all get like a tough book, and then that thing has like barely like minimum requirements, right? And we've talked about the minimum requirements equals minimum performance. And how do you think that's going to perform once you're running a subset of the functionality that a server with 256 gigs of RAM is running on your 4 gig of RAM laptop with a Intel Celeron or whatever, the cheapest, processor that you have. How do you think that's going to perform? It's going to be awful, right? So then from the performance being awful, you get people slamming their laptops against the ground, which is cool because they're tough books and they can take that. But then they're going to say the Dynamics is awful. And if Dynamics is awful, how is it awful? Because the partner implementing Dynamics is awful. And everything goes back to you. And you're just sitting back like, dude, I told you guys, let's not do offline mode. But you're telling me that that's the only way to do it. Now, in 2018, and since 2017, 2016, we have the mobile applications. The mobile applications for tablets and phones can do offline mode. And they can do it much better than Outlook Client would ever do it. So because of that, Outlook Client in offline mode, not even once. Stay away from it. The app for Outlook, obviously, I prefer to use that on top of the client, but the app for Outlook doesn't give you access to the data, especially not offline, at least until now, late September of 2018. Not yet. Hopefully someday we will. But as of now, the app for Outlook doesn't give you access to it. The Outlook client, which is the hard-coded plugin that you install on your local workstation, it does have offline mode, but I never, ever use it. I wish it was like a separate installation that you have to do. And I do understand that when you run the client installation, you get an option that says you want to install offline mode, you can skip it. But that leaves that button in there. It's like a magnet for users. They see, you want to install offline mode. And if the user is an administrator on the local machine, they say yes, and now they install this local copy of their data into the workstation. Come on. Please, get rid of it. So, yes, offline mode, not a big fan. Number 7, one of the things I never do, and this one actually came from experience, but not experience in a project that I did. Rather, it was experience on someone who I met. Actually, I have 3 kids, and one of my sons, my middle son Michael, he went to the same school with his other kid. And I don't remember what it was, fundraiser or something. There was something for school, those things that you go because your kid is part of it or whatever. So I went to this meeting, and of course you talk to the other parents, like, what do you do? I don't know, like our kids pick each other. The funny thing is the guy worked for a cloud company, so they did hosting, and I don't know if it was on Microsoft clouds. I do remember them talking about other companies like SoftLayer, for example. They were implementing some servers on SoftLayer for sure, because I remember having that conversation. I'm a big fan of SoftLayer. At least before they got acquired by IBM, they were killing it right in the cloud game. But we were talking about it, and I remember that during that meeting I got along with the guy, and then when we went back to the second one, I talked to him, and he was looking for a job. And I talked to him, I think his name was Tyler. Let's just say Tyler. And I remember, hey, Tyler, what's going on? And he said, actually, our company just went through an audit with Microsoft, and we got fined $2 million. $2 million for avoiding licensing. So that is what number 7 is, which is disregard licensing limitations. Completely play down the fact that you have a set of limitations on licenses, like team member license or plan license or app license, right? There are some limitations on those, but they are not hard. They're sort of on an honor system, right? You can take a team member and make him a system admin. No problem. You can take multiple users, like it happened. I was talking to another MVP that was telling me about their customer, how their customer confessed to them that, how come you have 100 people in your company, but you're only buying 10 licenses? Who are these 10 people? Oh, no, don't worry. We take turns with them. We have multiple people logging in under the same user account. Don't do that. Like that's one of those things that you don't play low. You sort of like, this completely disregard the limitations. And again, the company that Tyler was working for, they, after an audit, get penalized by $2 million, and they went bankrupt. They had to close the company because they couldn't pay that. So a business ceased to exist because they downplayed the licensing limitations from the products they were using. And they weren't using Dynamics. I remember that because I remember talking to Tyler about this, and he just wanted to know more about it. They weren't using that in their company. I think they were, I don't know if they were with Salesforce, or I don't remember exactly what CRM system they were using, but I do remember that they had problems all across the board. They found issues with Exchange and SQL and SharePoint and all of these other solutions, right? That they were essentially having, a bunch of, because they were on-prem, right? They were in SoftLayer in a separate cloud platform. They were, paying for 10 users, but they had 100 people logging in. And of course, all of that stuff works in the Honor system too. And they went back, did an audit, realized that for the last 8 years or whatever, these people haven't been paying for access to all of those solutions, and it amounted to like $2 million, and they had to close the company. So one of the things I don't like to do is to disregard licensing limitations or play that down. Don't do it. If you have multiple people, they can log in under the same user account, like I mentioned, like that other customer was doing, then get a device license. You can get that. It's barely more money than a user license. And then at that point, you have unlimited users. Now, if what you want to do is to allow multiple people to be logged in at the same time from different machines and all of that, there's no license for that, right? You're either a named user or you're a device. That's it. So if you're in one device, one computer in a kiosk or in an office somewhere, or maybe you're doing, on a call center or whatever, and you have one workstation that multiple agents will be connecting to, that's fine. Get a device license. Maybe a laptop or a tablet on a truck, and you're doing deliveries and multiple people are using that, no problem. Get a device license if that's the case. But if you're going to get a username license, use one person to use that named user license, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to add. Again, it was devastating to hear that a whole company can go down because of how they downplayed licensing, and you shouldn't do it either. Okay, we're getting close to the end. We're also getting close to the hour. Hopefully you're still listening, still going strong. You probably broke this up into multiple sections, but we're down to 3. Okay, number 8. This one, I feel like I should take a break for this one because it really, really upsets me, which is when partners or professionals or anyone, I don't care who you are, when they use code for things that you can do with business rules, calculated fields, roll-up fields, and other things that are out of the box that are easily upgradable, at least for the most part, right? For now, I would say, easily upgradable to the next versions of Dynamics, which we know, especially if you're online, you're going to get that twice a year, but instead, you decide to use code for it. Why? No, please don't do that. This is one of those things that not even once. If I can solve something with a workflow, or whether it's real time or in the background, doesn't matter, right? Whether if I can resolve it with a business rule, either server side or entity level scope business rule, or based on a form or all forms or whatever it is, whether I can do it with a calculated field or a roll-up field, why would I use code? Why? It's just, honestly, I know that some partners have been using code before those things existed, and it's a lot easier to sort of copy and paste. It costs the customer less if you're working in a time and materials basis, because you're reusing the code. Essentially, you're copying and pasting from previous projects. There's always, there's a constant, obviously, between projects where people always want to control visibility and things like that. So it's a lot easier to just move your standard libraries for form visibility and manipulation, and then just use the code. It's faster. You don't charge as many hours as if you had to create all these business rules and all this other stuff. But it's not the right thing to do. Right? There's only a way to do it, and that is effective or ineffective. It's about doing it right. And I think that if you have a requirement that can be solved by an out-of-the-box solution like a business rule or a calculated field or something like that, if it can be solved by it, I think you're doing a huge disservice by writing code or creating a plugin or whatever it is. And I think that in some cases, I don't think that partners know this. I feel that there's a gap. And if I ask my fellow CRM MVP developers and other developers in the field, I feel that, especially ones that understand the functional side of things, I think that there's a gap with a lot of developers that might not know what Dynamics can do out of the box. So it's easier for someone to create a plugin or write a script to do something that a 5-minute, business rule can do, because I don't know that business rule can do that. I understand that there might be a gap with that. But if you knowingly do this, if you knowingly go and write code for something you can do with something out of the box, come on. Come on, man. Maybe that should have been the title of this episode. Come on, man. So that is number 8. Moving on to number 9. We're almost done, guys. Number 9 on my list of not even once, is enabling audit without configuring it first, right? Just turning on audit and let it run while. You should never do that. Why? Because storage, especially on CRM Online or Dynamics 365 Online, it's golden. And audit can grow really fast, especially if you enable it at the beginning. When you're doing a ton of data migrations and things like that, your audit logs are going to start growing like crazy. And audit logs online, they last 3 months. You don't get to pick that. They just last 3 months. So your logs will start growing. Next thing you know, you have 2 or 3 gigs of audit logs that you cannot delete because you're stuck for 3 months with a single log. And depending on your data retention rules, you might have to keep those things for a year or 2 years or whatever it is. And now you're stuck paying extra storage because your audit logs are occupying all that space. No, go and configure it. You can configure audit at the field level, at the entity level, right? You can go back and say, here are the important fields, the 10 or 20 or whatever fields that are important to me, and I want to track audit on those. If you have a field that says, when was the last time this was, synchronized through integration, is that super important for you to track that? Especially if you have an integration that runs every 30 minutes or every hour or whatever, right? Near real-time integration. Do you really need to track every 15 minutes when that thing runs that record was integrated? Maybe you do. But in a lot of cases, I feel that people audit fields that they just don't make any sense. Like, why do you need to audit modified by if the audit log is already tracking who modified it? It's like it defeats the purpose. It's double the storage. You have limited storage. Wake up, right? So don't enable audit and leave it. Let it be, right? Configure it. Make the right decision with entities and fields that you need, and then turn it on. Let it run. Capture the thing. And that's rule number 9. All right, finally, and this is a big one, and this is probably a whole episode on its own. However, I'm going to try to minimize this thing as much as possible. This is something that I believe in deeply as a solution architect, and I think that most solution architects I respect believe this deeply, which is never, ever trade performance for functionality. Never. And what I mean by that is there's always solution architects out there. There's always customizers or functional consultants out there that see no problem making a system slow just to achieve some functionality that is not absolutely needed. Now, obviously, we know that when you get Dynamics out of the box, Dynamics CRM Online out of the box, it comes with a bunch of entities and fields and views and all this kind of, so all these different components, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. We know that every time you add something, even if you add an option to an option set, or you change something in Dynamics, every time you add a chart or whatever it is, right? You are slowing down the system. You're adding more objects to the databases. Now the system needs to work harder to find the right information, to determine whether you have access to something or not. There's going to be work involved. And the more customization, the more data, the more things you add to Dynamics, you're slowing the system down. Now, adding a single thing, adding a single field or a single option is not going to, you're not going to notice that, right? It's like you can never pick when someone became, a man or a woman. There's no date. You cannot say, well, 15. It's sort of like there's a progression. So you're not going to notice from a day to day that you're aging, but when you look back years later, you can see that you have aged, right? It's the same with dynamics. You add a single field, you're not going to see anything. You add a little thing here, a little thing there, nothing. But once you accumulate all of the stress that you've put in the system with all these customizations, you will see a big difference. You will affect the performance of it. And I absolutely hate it. It's disgusting to see when solution architects will compromise performance for functionality that is not really needed. Like sometimes you see this like, we just added a huge iframe on the form that loads up every time you open a contact. Okay, do you need to see the stuff every time you open a contact? Not really, but the customer said it would be cool. No. Having an iframe that loads every time you open a form destroys performance. It destroys it. You should never favor functionality or UI for performance because you could have the coolest looking Nobel Prize winning CRM system ever. Looks awesome. Oh my God. You have 10 iframes on that form. It looks dope once it's all loaded. But if it takes me 2 minutes to open a contact, I'm not going to use it. As a user, I'm not going to use it. Doesn't matter how awesome it looks, right? So you should never trade performance for functionality. You should always design for performance. Now, we know that adding functionality to Dynamics is necessary to customize the system, but you should always think of performance first. What is the best way to do it? The customer needs to connect documents from SharePoint to a record. Use the out-of-the-box document functionality in the record. Go to that tab and look at the documents. The customer doesn't really want to click once or twice to see the documents. We should add an iframe that loads up SharePoint, the SharePoint folder, every time the customer opens the record. No, don't do that. And we've talked customers out of this before, multiple times, where they say, look, I just want to open the record and see everything. Just everything in one place. Documents from SharePoint, activities. I want to see everything in one place. Sounds cool. However, if that means that it's going to take you 45 seconds to navigate from one record to another, is that going to be a benefit for you? Just because you don't want to click twice to go see the documents, does that grant the fact that now I'm going to go from 2 or 3 seconds to open a record to 42 or 43 seconds? Come on. Don't trade functionality and performance. Don't do it. Always design for performance. Always architect for performance. You do have the things that you need to achieve functionality wise. You have customizations you have to implement, but don't jeopardize the user adoption. That's what you're doing. You're jeopardizing user adoption because you want to achieve some functionality that might not be that important. Okay? So I never ever trade performance for functionality. I'd rather have a super simple solution that performs super fast than to have, oh my God, it looks like a Christmas tree of beautiful customizations in every form and every little corner that I look at. That might be attractive for some people, not for me and not for users. And that is the end of episode number 37. We went a little bit over an hour. I would like to thank everyone who stuck all the way to the end, listened to this episode. Cannot wait to hear your feedback. If you have any feedback, if you want to send it over, you don't want to wait till the summit or wait till you see me again, you can always reach out on Twitter at CRMMVP Podcast. You can also send us an email, info@crmmvppodcast.com. Let me know what you think. If you took notes, you disagree with some of them or all of them, whatever it is, send them over. I would like to learn. I'll respond to it, of course. You have access to it also. If you want to suggest topics or guests for future episodes. And by the way, I will say that I've gotten a few recommendations for guests, but just sending me the name of somebody is not enough for me to really understand what we're going to be talking about. Sometimes I get, messages like, oh, you should talk to our CEO from, whatever company in Australia or Asia or Europe or whatever. You should have our CEO as your guest. Great, but what are we going to talk about? Are we going to talk about your company and what do you guys do in your products and all of that? Because we don't have any sponsors, as you can tell. I want to talk about what works for everyone and what works for me. I don't want to, essentially focus in one particular company or product. I want to be very, sort of unbiased about my opinion and what works and doesn't work. So yeah, I do get some emails sometimes. You should interview this person or that person, but tell me what we're going to talk about or what do you think we should talk about so we can make a compelling sort of argument to record a podcast episode. So again, I encourage you to reach out to me. I love the feedback. I love your suggestions for topics and for guests, and just keep them coming. So again, info@crmmvppodcast.com. As always, you can always find all of our episodes on iTunes and the Google Play Store and whatever else you get your podcast on. I use Overcast, by the way, to listen to podcasts. I'm addicted to podcasts. I rarely listen to music anymore, only when I'm doing work and I just want to have some music in the background. But if I'm traveling, if I'm driving, whatever it is, I always listen to podcasts. And it's another thing we can talk about. If you're into podcasting, I'd love to talk to you about that and the stuff that I listen to. But on top of that, crmmvppodcast.com. That's where you can get all of our episodes. We'll see you in a couple of weeks on episode number 38. See you then.